In science, things change slowly and then overnight. And I'm going to show you, that's pretty important, right? I'm going to show you, using watches, how that happened in a very, very specific way, and in a way that changed the world almost overnight. So, this is some poetry. This is 18th century, I believe. And this is how most people experience time. They laid in bed, they heard the clock tick, and thought of you. And they had flashbacks to moon nights, and all these words are really, really weird. Almost left behind, a suitcase of memories, time after some time, which is the first line of that. This is how clocks were. They were on a wall, they didn't move, and you didn't really use them for anything besides maybe timing your dinner or whatever. Then all of a sudden you had stuff like this. So this guy right here, this is probably this is one of the first watches back in the 1500s. And the origin of the word watch was that a dude, watch, yes. The dude would walk around town, he was the rich guy in town, with a watch on his chest. So you would watch the rich guy with a watch on his chest and you could tell the time. You used to use the bells in the church or whatever. But now you could just go to the rich guy and say, what time is it? And he would have to tell you, I guess. France was really weird back then. Then you had stuff like carriage clocks. Carriage clocks were pretty cool. This is a thing that you put in your car, or your carriage, I guess, and then bring it back into the house, because you didn't want to leave that in the carriage, because somebody would steal it, just like a radio. So you had this carriage clock going back in and out, and this is what you used for centuries to tell time. This is how you tell the speed of things. This is how they did most of their science, with garbage clocks like this. Then you had, this is actually an original car clock, which was a mechanical clock that was inside a car. So you had to wind it up when you got into your car. So I guess that was the least of your worries when you got into one of those old cars. So suddenly time became vitally important. After discovering longitude with time, we can go into that later if I have another 2 hours. Aviators were using watches to tell how far they've gone and at what speed. They had tachometers on their watches. It was by eyeball, essentially. And the first guy to take a flight in a plane with wheels, the Wright brothers were a bunch of punks because they had like a sled and they just like pushed it. And this guy had wheels. Look at this guy. He's got some wheels. He's got that monster up there. It's like a skull. He took off on wheels in 1905. This proved that the French are better to us for about a year. And I love the French implicitly if anybody's French. He got this watch because he told Cartier in Paris that as he was flying, he had to pull out his big old pocket watch and look at it and put it back to get anything done. So Cartier said, hey, let's make you a wristlet. This used to be called a wristlet. And they made this thing called the Santos, which is a very small watch. It has a little, there's a little jewel on over here. And this is kind of fancy. This isn't something that you would wear to the war. This is something you would wear if you're a fancy flying guy in Paris back in 1905. But this was the first aviator watch. Aviator watches now look really big and expensive, but this was basically your first one. Then, in some kind of historical blip, everybody got a watch after they flew the plane, not before. This is Belova gave Charles Lindbergh a watch, which again, it looks like something that you wouldn't want to wear in a plane, especially if it was about to crash, because it wouldn't survive and you wouldn't be able to tell what time you died. Or actually you would, implicitly. All right, so I guess that it was a good idea. Anyway, so it's a pretty nice watch. These are nicer watches. Remember, these are mechanical things strapped to people's wrists, used for the specific purpose of scientific investigation. It would be the equivalent of running around with like a test tube made out of, I don't know, stone back in the old days. That doesn't make sense, but let's use that for this moment together. Meanwhile, there's other stuff happening in the world of timekeeping. So one of the cooler things are these things. Have you guys seen this? The Nixie Tube? I think I have a little spiky thing, like a little shooter thing. I can shoot, see? So this is called a Nixie Tube. And what this is layer after layer of numbers inside a vacuum tube. And when you put electricity through each one of those numbers, they light up in this orange glow. This is 1955. They started introducing digital watches, digital clocks of this type. And these were massively expensive. These were hundreds of thousands of dollars for some of these things. But This is the first time you got to see counters in time in a digital way. The reason why it's called Nixie, so you can use this in trivia. It started out numeric indicator experiment number 1, Nixi, or 1, and then Nixie. So it wasn't like something named after Richard Nixon as a pixie, it was named after that. And I don't understand this. I didn't do enough research because I'm not smart. But I don't understand why they only did one of them. And then they immediately said, yeah, that's the one we're going to use. We'll just use this one. Because we're going to stop with our indicator experimental numbers 2 through 50 and just stick on the number 1. But there you have it. That was science back in the old days. This is the first quartz clock. It's a quartz clock that you could travel with. It's in a handsome case. It can be yours for the low price of probably about $5,000 back then. It was a world clock because it had a world drawn on it. But it's not big because there's lots of cool stuff it's doing. It's big because that's basically all the space it needed to have a quartz clock inside. Right now you can find a quartz clock that fits inside your nose, whereas this is a quartz clock that fits inside a briefcase. Are we enjoying this? This is fun? You like watches? Somebody is very excited. And this is the first quartz movement. First quartz watch movement. And it was a vibrating piece of quartz that sort of moved the hand around the face and just sort of it generated a pulse so you could time things. This was massively expensive. We're going to talk about how expensive this was later on. So, we're talking about two concurrent things. We're talking about an industry bathed in tradition. It's been around for 200 years, not 2,000 years. That'd be really cool if it was, because then we'd have a whole different world. It'd be like a clockwork steampunk world where computers were made out of clockwork. I could write a book about that. So we have a mechanical watch world that's vitally important to everything. People were flying in airplanes using mechanical watches. If your mechanical watch stopped, you threw it away and you bought another one. Rolex, for all intents and purposes, was the equivalent of Timex. It was fairly cheap back then. Not really, really cheap, but it was fairly cheap. And you could go to the store and you pick one up and you walk around with them. Now Rolex is all fancy because that's the only way they can sell them, through lust. But back then it wasn't that way. Now, we're also going to talk about, remember we talked about how things changed quickly and then overnight. Or slowly and then overnight. That'd be an entirely different talk, Jesus. I had some barbecue earlier, which may be the concern here. So this industry is just like a lot of industries today. Oil, gas, the idea that solar is going to take over, wind power, all this other crazy stuff. They didn't see what was coming. And I want to show you why they didn't see what was coming and why they were so snooty in Switzerland. It was because of this. Because of that. Because of that. There you go. Look at that. You see that? That's why Switzerland thinks it's better than the world. That's Swiss, and this is a quartz clock watch. So the Swiss were like, look at our seconds hand. It goes really, really smoothly across the face. And look at this garbage. What is this garbage? What kind of watch does this? And actually, they had a complication that actually recreated this in a smaller pocket watch. But they stopped doing that because they could do that all the time. So they were convinced, absolutely convinced, 70s, 80s, the Swiss watch industry was completely convinced that they were going to survive because they could do that. And this is what a quartz watch did. Now, as we all know, since we're all wearing Rolexes right now, this is completely true, yes? This is the point when Switzerland realized they were pretty much screwed. Are we allowed to say bad words? They were pretty much messed up. The Apollo 11 flight, this was the interior of the cockpit. And this is like a UI horror. I mean, you really got to know what the hell's going on in this thing. But the important thing is, there's not a lot of clocks up there. You don't really know what time it is. So you got a bunch of switches, you got a bunch of other stuff. There's got to be a bathroom in there somewhere, but there's no clocks. So, historically, all the astronauts, the spacemen, as they're called in my parlance, had watches that they bought at retail. They would go to the store, they'd pick them up. They all wore Breitlings, they all wore all these regular watches. And it was kind of willy-nilly until Apollo 11. They all decided they were all going to wear the same watch. This was going to be the watch that NASA was going to use forever and ever and ever. So they sent a letter to Switzerland, and Switzerland said, oh, I don't know, we can't help you because it's NASA, and who wants a watch in space, really? I'm being sarcastic and trying to be funny, failing miserably. So we have this problem. They can't get any good watches. They need RFPs. They're trying to send out these things. So eventually, all the U.S. representatives of these watch companies come in and say, all right, we'll help you out. We'll send you some watches. So I believe it was Breitling, Wittnauer, and Omega sent in watches to test. They were the only 3 companies that sent them in. Switzerland's over there eating some fondue and some delicious Saint-Jacques oyster and tooling around in small French cars. And they didn't even care. They had no idea that space existed, let alone that they should put their stuff up there. So the Americans sent over a couple watches. The American representative sent over a couple watches. All of the astronauts tried all the watches, and they really settled on one, which was the Omega Speedmaster. This is quite literally the last mechanical object, micromechanical object in space. This little Speedmaster. Sure, we've probably sent like toys and stuff up and whatever things that they need to do the things with their stuff up there. As you see, I'm a learned man in regards to the space program. This is the watch. You can still buy this watch, and these watches are fairly sought after, but you notice all this stuff. This is the test. They engraved them all. They put them on this crazy Velcro strap. Velcro back in the 60s. That's pretty wild, right? And they checked them in and checked them out. They had to run through customs when they came back from space. But this is the watch that was in space. This was the last micromechanical object, timekeeping object, that was sent into space on purpose, right? So this was the culmination, the absolute culmination of horological history, which is a study of watches, not other stuff. This is the culmination of that. Hundreds and hundreds of years of research and building and doing amazing things with watches. The watch on my wrist right now is really nice, and it's got lots of gears in it, and it can tell elapsed time, but can it call my mother? Absolutely not. This is basically the state of the art for watchmaking, and they had it up in space. And the Swiss companies, what they should have done, they should have said, look, we sent a watch up into space. We should evolve and change and run with the times, and we're going to do really well. But you remember that previous thing, they didn't like that the Quartz watches go tick, 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 and theirs went whoosh, right? So this is the watch, Omega. They're so happy. They sent watches in the moon. They had no idea that they sent watches in the moon until after the fact, and now it's a big marketing ploy, but God bless them. So technology changes slowly, then overnight. So in 1969, remember that watch I showed you guys, that Quartz, that Seiko? That cost about as much as a nice Toyota Corolla at the time. It was really expensive. Then 1970, a little after these moonwalks and moon landings, the first digital watch is sold. The digital watch with these Nixie tubes, actually smaller versions of it, and then it got very small, and you had the little light up LEDs. I don't know if you saw that one movie with William Dafoe, and he had a watch that said time to fuck on it. You remember this? Yes, yes, we do. That's a very, I saw it as a child. Still, that's why I love watches. 1978, Quartz gets massively cheap. As I said, you could feasibly sit a Quartz watch up your nose, and you could leave it there because it's that cheap. It doesn't really matter. 1980, total number of Swiss watchmakers. These are the scientists of their age, the highest precision scientists of their age. These guys were astronomers. They could make amazing small things. Fell from 90,000 to 28,000. By 1982, 600 watchmakers were left in Switzerland. And in 1983, if you can't beat them, join them, Swatch Group came out with the Swatch. The reason why they came out with the Swatch is because all these old fancy Swiss people went to the beach one day, and they looked around at these kids running around, handsome, beautiful faces, toned bodies, scantily dressed. And they noticed that they weren't wearing any watches. So they said, what are we going to do? And they sat down and they said, well, you know what? We're about to get eaten by this Quartz stuff. Why don't we sell a Quartz watch? And they said, no, we can't do that. That's impossible. But they did it. and now it's the entire basis of the Swiss watch industry. The Swiss watch industry looks like a pyramid. The base is all these garbage Swatch watches, which if you like them, fine. Next are mid-range watches, and by mid-range, I literally mean $5,000 to $10,000 watches, right? That's mid-range. And then the top are like these $500,000 monstrosities that were made out of unicorn hair and, I don't know, troll innards. And that's how the entire industry works. And if it weren't for these quartz watches, the entire industry would be dead right now. So here's a swatch, one of the first ones. And this, ultimately, is what destroyed all watches completely for all of us. Because this is NIST. And you can actually ping these servers and get the exact time from any device, including all the devices that you guys have in your pockets right now. So, after all that hard work, walking around with a clock on his chest, feeling so good, and all these mechanical spacewalks with all these crazy watches, an industry was decimated literally overnight by just a few tweaks, scientific tweaks to the whole process. And what do you get from it? You get another watch, really. You get stuff like this, which has miniaturized everything. But if it weren't for those first space watches, if it weren't for the decision to move away from mechanics into electronics, we'd be in an entirely different world right now. These things couldn't exist. Most of our computers couldn't exist. Everything couldn't exist because everything depends on the proper reckoning of time. So there we have it. That's my story. I'm sticking with it.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Nite event near you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.